Good evening. We're in 1 Corinthians 9. The kiddos are asking questions tonight. For those of you that are visiting with us, we have 3 questions each evening, and so we start our Sunday night lessons with these questions to see how many kiddos were too busy thinking about candy and not studying today. Hope I hadn't caught anybody off guard here. Question number 1, 1 Corinthians chapter 9 was, I don't remember, what should you not do to an ox? Muzzle. Yeah, there you go. Good job. Got several answers. Don't muzzle the ox, right? Question number 2, what should we not hinder of Christ? The gospel of Christ. We should not do anything to hinder the gospel of Christ. And then the third one was, toward the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul said he became a Jew to those who were Jews. He became weak to those who were weak. He became as one outside the law to those who were outside the law. And so I just really asked the question to encompass all of that. Paul said he had become several things in order to do what? Okay, to win some, to win them over. If you drop down a couple verses, one of the verses says to save some. So win some, to win them over, or to save some. Paul was making the point that he was becoming what he needed to be in order that these people might appreciate and accept the truth of the gospel that he was teaching, and he didn't want to do anything to hinder the gospel. Of course, he was explaining his ministry there in 1 Corinthians 9, and of course he was teaching using the ox to teach that those who are working, we should actually support them as opposed to causing them difficulties or hardships, and therefore don't muzzle the ox while he's treading out the grain. And so, reward your animal for helping you in that capacity. So very good, very good. I'm glad you're answering these questions, and I look forward to this every Sunday evening. Our word for the week, we've been in a subcategory on life's challenges. And tonight we come to the last of those words, and I do want to kind of cover it very quickly so I don't have a PowerPoint or anything. I just want to make 3 stops in the Bible. If you'll make 3 quick stops with me, and then the lesson's yours. This is the last of the words under the category life's challenges before we move on next week, Lord willing, to another category on salvation words, and I'm really looking forward to that category. But tonight's word is grief. Grief has been defined as an emotional response to a loss, specifically to a loss that occurs because of death. They tell me that the greatest stressor in life is the death of a spouse for those who are married. They tell me that the greatest cause for depression in our society today is the death of a loved one. They tell me that grief has stages to it, stages like the stage. I thought it had. They tell me that there is a stage of shock involved with grief, and then there's a stage of bargaining, and then there's a stage of depression, and then there's a stage of anger, till finally there is the stage of acceptance. There's about 7 stages there, and for those of you that don't know my background, I spent about 6 years off and on in and out of the funeral home, so I've dealt a lot with grief in my life. I've watched people grieve differently. And what I've come to learn and realize is that oftentimes we think of stages as something people move through, and I want to challenge your thinking on that tonight and actually see the stages of grief more as a figure 8 where you're kind of weaving in and out of those stages, ultimately trying to get to the seventh one or the final one, and that being acceptance. But the reality of it is, psychologists are telling us that people might go through a period of numbness and then go through a period of shock, coming back into a period of denial before a period of anger. And so there's no rhyme or reason as to being able to develop a set of stages to say this is going to occur for you first, and then this will be second, and this will be third, and this will be fourth, because we all deal with loss differently. And psychologists are actually now pointing us to these same stages that they've always pointed us to, but they're saying, now realize that people may be weaving in and out of these stages, trying to ultimately get to the stage of acceptance, where we accept the loss, we accept the death, we accept the separation, we accept the pain and the heartache that is caused there, and we are able to process that in a way that is healthy. Because we know that anger is not healthy when it goes untamed, and we know that shock is not healthy. We certainly know that depression's not healthy. Numbness is not something you need to stay in forever, and certainly denial is not going to get you anywhere. And so ultimately, we are trying to move to this area of acceptance. What does the Bible have to say about grief? You know, we all have dealt with grief. Let's just be honest. We've all experienced loss. We've all experienced the loss of a loved one, someone very near and dear, some closer than others. But yet this is a word that has impacted and will impact all of us if the world continues to stand. Funerals occur every day. Very few weeks go by that on the prayer session back there we don't have at least one family, and sometimes 3 or 4. And what that reminds me of is that every week, someone that we're connected to, if not us ourselves, are experiencing grief. The first stop I want to make tonight's in John chapter 11. John chapter 11, you might have expected us to go to this passage. This is the context of the death of Lazarus. It would only seem normal, if we're going to talk about grief, to look at a death scene to try to figure out something about grief. In this first stop in John chapter 11, here's what I want you to see. I want you to see that different people need us to respond in different ways. Now, I could give you a lot of phrases, and the reality of it is I know you have said them, and I also know you're going to say them again, so I'll try to be careful here, okay? This is my favorite, and I mean this with all sincerity, but I cannot help but say it with a smile. This is my favorite. I've heard it many a times. Don't they look so good? Folks, they're dead. There's nothing good about it. You've never seen them that way before. You understand? I mean, they're not normal, because normal is standing upright and talking and alive, and they're in a state that they've never been in before. But that's my favorite. And what I know is what we're trying to say is that it ought to bring comfort to us that they look like who they are, and you know, it does resemble the person that we knew. I understand what we're trying to say, but I just got to be honest with you, that one always sticks in my mind. Here's another one. If you don't know what the person's going through, don't tell them you know. That one bothers me a little bit. If your father has passed away and my father is still living, I can't walk up to you and say, I know what you're going through, because that's not accurate. Be careful with that one. Now, if in fact they have lost someone that you have lost, I have had the occasion recently of telling someone that lost their grandparents parent. I know what you're going through. I have experienced that. But if someone's lost a spouse and your spouse is still living, be careful responding, I know what you're going through, because really you don't. You may think you do. You may have an idea of what it would be like, but the reality of it is, sometimes the best thing to say is nothing. And that's hard for us because we don't like silence, and it's awkward because we don't hang out at the funeral home. So when we go, we feel kind of awkward, and the family's there, and they don't normally hang out there, so they're kind of feeling, and it's just some awkward feelings, and then all of a sudden we just have to feel like we got to say something. And sometimes sometimes a hug says so much more than words. And I say all that not to beat you up about what you say when you're standing in line at the funeral home, but just to cause you to think, because different people respond differently. If you don't believe me, look in John chapter 11, verse 28 beginning. Verse 17 beginning. Now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Verse 20, Martha hears that Jesus was coming, and she goes to meet him, but Mary does not. Well, that shouldn't surprise us too much. Martha says to Jesus, verse 21, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. Martha's angry. Where you been, Jesus? I thought you cared about us. 4 days has passed. If you'd have been here, this wouldn't have happened. I know that whatever I ask from God, God will give. Jesus says to her, verse 23, your brother will rise again. Well, he responds to Martha's accusations by saying, Martha, just be at peace. Your brother will rise again. And Martha says, I know he'll rise again. I know the resurrection's coming. I know the last day's coming. I have comfort in that. But if you'd have been here, he wouldn't have had to die in the first place. And Jesus says in verse 25, I am the resurrection and the life, and whoever believes in me, though he die, yet he shall live, and everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? And she says, yes. Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. So Martha runs out to meet Jesus. Martha runs from the casket of her brother. She knows Jesus is coming, and she meets him out in the parking lot. And she says, now, Jesus, if you'd been here, this wouldn't have happened. And Jesus engages with this teaching about the resurrection and the life. And he who believes in me, if he does die, he can still live. And Martha's trying to make sense of all of this. Martha, do you believe this? And immediately you're going, man, she's grieving the death of her brother. And Jesus is teaching her some pretty deep stuff here. How could he expect her mind to be in the right place when her brother's dead? And yet he's trying to get her to understand something very, very spiritual and foundational. And you begin to go, poor Martha. I mean, why, Jesus? Why now? Why not just say, Martha, I'm sorry, you're right, I should have been here. Just tell her what she wants to hear and make all this better. Make all this, calm down and comforted and put her at peace. But yet Jesus has given her some very theological, is this really the time and place for this? The answer is yes. This is how Martha needed Jesus to respond. And Jesus knew that. But now, come to verse 28, I almost got ahead of myself. When she had said this, she sent and called Mary, saying in private, the teacher is here, calling for you. Jesus hadn't yet got into the village, and Mary goes out, verse 32 now for time's sake. When Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she falls at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. Now you stop right there, and immediately you go, the two sisters said the same thing. And you're right. But they said it in two different positions. Mary falls at the feet of Jesus with these that have been with her. And when Jesus sees her, verse 33, weeping, and the Jews that had come with her, they're crying, they're deeply moved in spirit, Jesus asked the question, where have you laid him? And they said, Lord, come and see. And then there it is, John 11 and verse 35. How did Jesus respond to Mary? He cried with her. He just went in and seeing all of those others with her crying, and he just says, he didn't say, your brother will live? Don't you know about the resurrection? I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he dies, yet he'll live. Don't you believe that, Mary? He didn't say any of that. He just asked, where is he? And he begins to cry with them. You see, what I'm reminded of from this passage is that we must respond to people because people respond to grief differently. And the way Jesus responded to Mary is so much different than the way he responded to Martha. Because though they be sisters biologically, they were two different people. And they were reacting to the death of their brother two different ways. And thus the wisdom on Jesus' part to know how to address them. We need to know how. We need to pray for wisdom on how to say, what to say, when to say, or maybe when not to say anything. The second stop I want you to go with me to is in Matthew 26. In Matthew 26, what we learn from Matthew 26 is some emotions that are associated with grief. Psychologists tell us about these stages and everything, but I want you to see the Bible's terminology in terms of emotions that people go through when facing death and dying. In Matthew 26, Jesus hadn't died yet, no, but he's facing death. He knows he's about to die. I want you to look at some emotions with me. We're in the garden, down about verse 37. And taking with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, James and John, Jesus began to be sorrowful and troubled. Immediately from verse 37, I see two emotions that are tied to those who are dealing with death and dying and grief. Some people are very sorrowful. And that sorrow manifests itself in a variety of ways. Some people go off and isolate themselves. Some people just put themselves in the midst of everybody. Some people cry. Some people laugh. Some people get mad. Sorrow can be expressed in a variety of ways, but it's certainly an emotional response to death and dying. Troubled. Why? Why now? What's the purpose? Why did it have to happen this way? Why not this person, or why that person? Why him, or why her? Why not me, or why not them? And all these questions trouble us and conjure all of this pain and heartache and people deal with that differently, and some takes years to deal with that, and some deal with it quicker, but they're troubled. Their lives are troubled. Their foundation is shaken. And everything they thought was just right is now not just right. And so they're trying to figure out how to put the pieces back together and figure out what the new normal looks like. And that creates troublesome times, days, weeks, months, years. Jesus felt that emotion facing this death. In verse 40, he came to his disciples and he found them sleeping. I dropped down there although I realize that one emotional response for some people is to just isolate themselves and go to bed. And there is an element of just hiding away, sleeping. And maybe that's healthy for a short period of time. I don't know. I'm not a psychologist. But I know some do. But what I'm thinking about here in this passage, can you imagine the feeling that Jesus had when he comes back and he finds them sleeping? Can you imagine the feeling of loneliness? Oftentimes when people are going through grief, they're very lonely. They feel very lonely. Even though the whole world may be surrounding them, they've bubbled themselves and all of a sudden they're just lonely. Everybody else in their minds is sleeping on them. Or how about this emotion? Careless. Careless. In other words, could Jesus have felt like they could care less about him and what was about to happen? What do you mean you're sleeping, guys? Going through one of the most difficult times in my life right now, and all you can do is sleep. Are you kidding me? Do you not care any more than that? And so it's often the case that with grief, the emotion of nobody cares for me, or all these people could care less, or I'm not important, or all of these thoughts can conjure up in your mind. It could be the furthest thing from the truth, yet because of the situation and the circumstances, because of the pain. Look at verse 43. And again he came and he found them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. Their eyes were heavy. They're emotionally drained. You know, a lot of times when grief hits, people are emotionally drained. You know why? Because they've been at the hospital for days, weeks, months. They've been sitting up around the clock, day and night, taking care, in and out, constantly. That the moment they close their eyes, they're constantly opening their eyes in fear that, their loved one needs something. Or a nurse is coming in to take vitals if it's at the hospital or nursing home. And so there's no rest. And then the inevitable happens where the death occurs and and so now you're just emotionally drained. You're physically exhausted. You're emotionally drained, and I don't know about you, but I don't do too well when I'm like that. I don't enjoy being like that. I don't ask to be like that, neither do you. But what I realize is that emotionally, I'm not in a position to be very productive for anybody, including myself. But that is a natural emotional response where we just become, our eyes are heavy. We are just exhausted. And grief can do that, and the dying process can do that to so many people. The third stop and the final stop is in Hebrews 4. And David read it a moment ago, and I've used this passage, I've used it even this past week to point out some things about Jesus in a lesson I was doing. But I bring you to it tonight to say, listen, you got an invitation. I have an invitation. The invitation went something like this in Matthew 11, beginning in verse 28, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden." That's how Jesus worded the invitation. Grief causes us to be heavy laden, and Jesus says, "Come unto me and I will give you rest." The songs we sing about being near to God and about God being with us and about it being well with our souls suggest to us that when we're in the presence of God, things can be and will be okay because of the comfort that God can provide. And in Hebrews chapter 4, there's an invitation here, verse 14. Since then, because of the fact that we have a high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. One of the saddest things for me is when someone approaches death and they allow death to cease their relationship with God. It's a sad occasion because death ought to do right the opposite. But someone becomes angry or someone gets so troubled that they are questioning the very existence of God, the very nature of God. They're wanting to know all the whys and ifs and what ifs, and God's not answering all those questions, and so they just let go of their confession of faith entirely. Hebrews 4 and verse 14 says, let us hold on to this confession of faith. Don't let grief drive you to the edge in your relationship with God. Let it do right the opposite. Let it drive you to the throne. Because verse 16 says, let us with confidence draw near to the throne of grace. For in drawing near there in confidence, we can have grace and mercy and help in times of need. Why? Because when we get in the throne room, there is one in the throne room who can, I skipped over verse 15, didn't I? Who can sympathize with us. Jesus is saying, I know what those tears are like. Hadn't you read John 11:35? I joined Mary and those Jewish companions who were with her that came out to find me. I cried with those folks, and those tears were real. Jesus says, I can sympathize. I've been there and done that. And I bought the t-shirt. And I got it. And I know. I understand. You see, it's grief that ought to give us the opportunity to point people to a God who understands what we're going through. It is an invitation to come with confidence because God is willing to help and wants to help and can provide. 2 Corinthians 1, beginning in verse 3, the comfort, the God of comfort, who can comfort us in our afflictions that we might be able to comfort others in their time of affliction. That God. It's an invitation that says, come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden. No, grief is not enjoyable. No, grief is not fun by any stretch of the imagination. But it is natural. It is human. And it is a part of the life process. And so as you read this week on the last word under life's challenges, know that there is a God who wants to help you with all the challenges of life. And tonight, if you're running from God, it's time to stop and run back to God and let God help. If we can assist you in that journey, we would love to, as together we stand and sing.